The text message arrived at 3:47 a.m. while I was lying in my hospital bed, still groggy from the emergency surgery that had saved my life just 12 hours earlier. The screen's blue glow cut through the darkness of my private room as I squinted at the words that would change everything. "Don't worry about anything at home, Rachel. I've got it all handled. Rest and recover. Love, Diane." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My sister-in-law had a key to my house for emergencies. What I didn't expect was for her to decide that my near-death experience was her invitation to completely take over my life. I'm Rachel Chen, and at 34, I thought I had my life figured out. I owned a successful graphic design agency in Portland, lived in a beautifully restored Victorian home in the Pearl District, and had spent years carefully curating a life that reflected my values and aesthetic. My house wasn't just where I lived. It was my sanctuary, my creative space, and the physical manifestation of everything I'd worked to build since my divorce 3 years ago. The emergency appendectomy that landed me in Oregon Health and Science University Hospital was supposed to be routine. A simple procedure, they said. 2 days in the hospital, maybe 3, and then home to recover for a week or 2. What started as severe abdominal pain during a client presentation had escalated into a life-threatening situation when my appendix ruptured. The surgeon later told me I was lucky. A few more hours and the infection could have killed me. My brother James lived in Seattle with his wife Diane, a relationship that had always been complicated for our family. James was my only sibling, 2 years older, and we'd grown closer after our parents passed away in a car accident 5 years ago. When he married Diane 8 years ago, I'd tried to welcome her into our small family, but something about her had always felt off. She was the type of person who smiled too much, asked too many personal questions, and seemed to catalog information about people for reasons I couldn't quite identify. Diane worked as a real estate agent, though she talked about it like she was running Trump's empire, rather than selling modest homes in suburban Seattle. She had opinions about everything: your career choices, your living situation, your relationship status, your life decisions. Most of the time, James deflected her commentary with good humor, but I'd noticed over the years how she'd slowly begun to wear him down with her constant need to fix and improve everything around her. The morning of my surgery, I'd called James from the ambulance, scared and alone. He wanted to drive down immediately, but I assured him I'd be fine. It was just an appendectomy, after all. Routine surgery. I'd be home in a couple of days. What I needed was for someone to check on my house, maybe water my plants, and ensure my security system was functioning properly. That's when James mentioned that Diane had the week off and could easily drive down to help. "She'd love to help out," he'd said, and I could hear her voice in the background already making plans. "You know how she is. She'll take care of everything." That should have been my first warning. The surgery went well, considering the complications from the rupture. Dr. Martinez, my surgeon, explained that they'd had to clean out more infection than initially expected, which meant a longer recovery time and a few extra days in the hospital for observation. The pain medication made everything fuzzy, and I spent most of the first day drifting in and out of sleep, grateful to be alive and looking forward to getting home to my own bed, my own space, my own routine. Diane's first text had been sweet and supportive. "Just arrived at your place. Everything looks good. Don't worry about a thing." The second text, 6 hours later, was more concerning. "Found some expired food in your fridge. Cleaned it all out. You'll thank me later." By evening, the messages were coming more frequently, and with an increasingly proprietorial tone that made my stomach clench in ways that had nothing to do with my surgical incisions. "Rearranged your living room. Much better flow now. Threw away those old magazines cluttering your coffee table. Found a great local grocery store and stocked you up with healthy options." Each message felt like a small violation, but I was trapped in my hospital bed, dependent on pain medication, and trying to convince myself that Diane was just being helpful. She was family after all. She was taking care of my home while I couldn't. I should be grateful, not paranoid. The third day brought a video call that shattered any remaining illusions about Diane's intentions. "Rachel, honey, you look so much better." Diane's face filled my phone screen, but behind her, I could see my living room and nothing looked familiar. The furniture had been completely rearranged. My carefully chosen artwork was gone from the walls. The vintage Persian rug I'd inherited from my grandmother was nowhere to be seen. "I've been so busy making improvements. Wait until you see what I've done with the place." "Improvements?" I managed to ask, though the word came out weaker than I intended. "Oh yes, your house has such good bones. But honestly, Rachel, your decorating style was so dark. Everything was so heavy and serious. I've opened it up, brought in some light, made it more welcoming. You're gonna love the changes." She turned the phone to give me a tour, and with each room she showed me, my heart sank deeper. My home office, where I'd spent countless hours building my business, had been transformed into what looked like a meditation room, complete with crystals and inspirational quotes on the walls. My library, filled with art books and novels I'd collected over years, had been organized into color-coordinated arrangements that completely ignored my careful cataloging system. The kitchen, my favorite room in the house where I loved to cook elaborate meals for friends, had been stripped of personality and turned into something resembling a medical facility. "And wait until you see the master bedroom," Diane continued, her voice bubbling with excitement. "I brought in some feng shui principles. Your energy is going to be so much better when you get home." The master bedroom tour revealed that she'd gotten rid of my king-sized bed, the one I'd saved for months to buy after my divorce, and replaced it with what appeared to be a hospital-style adjustable bed. My dresser, a beautiful antique piece I'd restored myself, was gone. In its place stood a modern white plastic organizer that looked like it belonged in a college dormitory. "Where's my furniture?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Oh, that old stuff? Rachel, most of it was in terrible condition. I donated what was salvageable and threw away the rest. You'll thank me when you're not surrounded by all that negative energy anymore. I researched post-surgical recovery, and what you need is a clean, minimalist environment that promotes healing." The room began to spin, and it wasn't from the pain medication. Diane had systematically dismantled my home, my sanctuary, my carefully crafted personal space, and replaced it with her vision of what my life should look like. She'd made these decisions without consulting me, while I was vulnerable and dependent on her help. "Diane," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need you to put everything back the way it was." Her laugh was bright and dismissive. "Oh, honey, you're just overwhelmed because you're not feeling well. Once you're home and settled, you'll see how much better everything is. I spend so much time researching the best ways to create a healing environment. This is exactly what you need." "It's my house," I said more firmly. "I want my furniture back. I want my things back." "Rachel, you're being emotional because of the surgery and all the medications. Trust me on this. I have experience with home staging and creating positive living spaces. Everything I've done is for your benefit. You'll adjust to."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The changes, and then you'll realize how much better your life is, without all that clutter. Clutter. She'd called my carefully chosen possessions, my books, my art, my personal treasures, clutter. After ending the call, I lay in my hospital bed staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had just happened. Diane hadn't just helped with my house. She'd colonized it. She'd decided that my taste, my choices, my way of living were wrong, and had taken it upon herself to correct them while I was incapacitated and unable to stop her. The next few hours brought a series of increasingly disturbing updates. Photos of my bathroom, where she'd thrown away my skincare routine and replaced it with organic products she'd chosen. Messages about contractors she'd called to fix problems with my house that I'd never considered problems. Updates about appointments she'd made on my behalf with cleaners, organizers, and even a nutritionist who would help me start fresh when I returned home. Each message made it clearer that Diane wasn't just helping. She was systematically erasing my identity and replacing it with her version of who I should be. That evening, when Dr. Martinez made his rounds, he found me sitting up in bed, fully alert despite the pain medication, making lists on my phone. "How are you feeling, Rachel? You look more energetic than I've seen you since the surgery." "I'm fine," I said, which was true in a way. The fog of medication and post-surgical disorientation had lifted, replaced by a clarity that was sharp and cold. "Actually, I need to ask you something. How much longer do I need to stay here?" "Well, We were thinking another day or two for observation, just to make sure there are no complications from the infection. Why? Are you uncomfortable? Is there something we can do to make your stay more pleasant? I need to get home, I said simply. There's a situation I need to handle. Dr. Martinez sat down in the chair beside my bed, his expression shifting to professional concern. Rachel, I know being away from home is difficult, especially when you're recovering from a serious surgery. But rushing your recovery could lead to complications. What's so urgent that it can't wait a few more days? I showed him the photos Diane had sent, explaining the situation as objectively as I could. His expression grew more concerned as I described how my sister-in-law had essentially taken over my home and life without my consent. This is unusual, he said finally. Has this person shown this kind of behavior before? She's always been controlling, but nothing like this. I think she sees my surgery as an opportunity to fix what she perceives as problems with my life. Dr. Martinez was quiet for a moment, then pulled out his phone. Rachel, I'm going to make some calls. There are resources available for situations like this, and you shouldn't have to choose between your physical recovery and protecting your home and personal property. Over the next hour, Dr. Martinez connected me with a patient advocate who specialized in helping people deal with boundary violations during medical crises. Janet Morrison was a woman in her 50s who'd seen every variation of family dysfunction that illness could reveal. What you're describing is more common than you might think, Janet told me during our phone consultation. Medical emergencies often bring out controlling behaviors in family members who feel helpless. They can't fix your health, so they try to fix everything else around you. But she's destroyed my home, I said. She's gotten rid of my furniture, my belongings, my personal items. How is that helping? It's not about helping you, Janet explained gently. It's about helping her feel useful and in control. The problem is that her need to feel helpful has overridden your autonomy and personal boundaries. The question now is, what do you want to do about it? I want her out of my house, and I want my life back. Then we need to talk about your options. Janet explained that while Diane's actions might not be technically illegal, she had been given permission to access the house. After all, they definitely constituted a violation of personal boundaries that could escalate if not addressed immediately. She recommended documenting everything Diane had done, establishing clear boundaries, and, if necessary, involving law enforcement to ensure those boundaries were respected. Do you have other family members who could intervene? Janet asked. My brother James, but he's… I paused, thinking about how to explain James's relationship with his wife. He's not good at standing up to her. He tends to avoid conflict by going along with whatever she wants. That's unfortunately common in these situations. The person causing the boundary violations often has a history of wearing down resistance through persistence and emotional manipulation. But Rachel, this is your home, your life, your recovery. You get to decide how those things are managed. After my conversation with Janet, I called my business partner and best friend, Maya Rodriguez. Maya had been my rock through my divorce, the launch of our design agency, and every major crisis of the past 5 years. If anyone would understand the magnitude of what Diane had done, it would be Maya. She did what? Maya's voice came through the phone with barely controlled fury after I'd explained the situation. Rachel, that's not helping. That's psychological warfare. I know, but she has James convinced that she's being supportive and helpful. James needs to open his eyes. This isn't support. This is someone imposing their will on a person who's vulnerable and can't fight back. It's predatory. Maya offered to drive up from her home in Eugene immediately, but I had a different plan forming. No, I need you to do something else for me. I need you to call David. David Kim was a security consultant we'd used for our business when we'd had problems with a former client who wouldn't accept the end of our professional relationship. He specialized in personal security for small business owners and had helped us establish protocols for protecting both our professional and personal spaces. You want to bring in professional security? Maya asked. I want to document everything that's happened, establish that Diane has exceeded any reasonable interpretation of the help I asked for, and I want her removed from my property before she does any more damage. What about James? James is going to have to choose between his wife's feelings and his sister's basic rights. It's time he learned that avoiding conflict isn't the same thing as keeping peace. Maya agreed to contact David and explain the situation. Within 2 hours, I had a plan. David's companies specialized in what he called boundary enforcement. They worked with people who were dealing with stalkers, abusive ex-partners, overly involved family members, and anyone else who refused to respect personal space and autonomy. What Diane was doing fell clearly into their area of expertise. The key, David explained during our phone consultation, is documentation and clear communication. We need to establish that your sister-in-law has exceeded the scope of help you requested, document the extent of the changes she's made without your permission, and create a clear record of your attempts to set boundaries. And if she refuses to leave voluntarily, then we involve law enforcement. What she's done, disposing of your personal property, making major changes to your living space without consent, essentially taking over your home. Those actions have legal implications, especially when the homeowner is incapacitated and unable to consent to such extensive changes. David's plan was methodical and professional. First, he would conduct surveillance of my property to document the current state of the house and Diane's presence there. Then, he would attempt to make contact with her to clearly communicate that her help was no longer needed and that she needed to vacate the property. If she refused, he would involve local law enforcement to ensure she left peacefully. The goal isn't to create drama, David emphasized. It's to restore your control over your own living space and personal property. Everything we do will be legal, documented, and designed to protect your rights as a homeowner. That evening, I called James. "Rachel, how are you feeling?" "Diane says you're doing so much better." "James, I need Diane to leave my house immediately." There was a long pause. "What do you mean? She's there to help you. She's been working around the clock to make sure everything is perfect for when you come home." "She's gotten rid of my furniture, James. She's thrown away my belongings. She's completely changed my house without my permission. But she said those were improvements. She said you needed a better environment for recovery. Did I ask for improvements? Did I ask her to throw away my things and redecorate my house?" Another pause. "Well, no, but Rachel, you've been in the hospital. You haven't been thinking clearly because of the pain medication." Diane researched everything. She knows what's best for recovery environments. "James, it's my house, my belongings, my life. Diane doesn't get to decide what's best for me, especially when what's best for me is keeping the home I've spent years creating." "You're being ungrateful," James said, and I could hear Diane's influence in his words. "She's sacrificed her entire week to help you. She's spent her own money improving your living situation. The least you could do is appreciate what she's done." "I didn't ask her to spend money on my house. I asked her to water my plants and check that everything was secure. That's it." "Rachel, I think the surgery and the medication are making you paranoid. Diane loves you like a sister. Everything she's done has been motivated by care and concern for your well-being. Then she can show that care and concern by respecting my wishes and leaving my house immediately. I'm not going to ask my wife to leave when she's been nothing but generous and helpful." "You need to think about what you're saying." "I have thought about it, James, and tomorrow Diane is going to be asked to leave by professional security. You can choose to support your sister's basic right to control her own living space, or you can choose to enable your wife's boundary violations. But Diane is leaving my house." I hung up before James could respond. The next morning, Dr. Martinez agreed to discharge me a day early, provided I had someone to check on me at home and follow up with him in 3 days. Maya had driven up from Eugene and was waiting in the hospital lobby, armed with a plan and a determination that matched my own. "David and his team are already at your house," she told me as we signed the discharge paperwork. "They've documented everything Diane has done, and they're prepared to ask her to leave. The question is, do you want to be there when it happens?" I thought about facing Diane directly, seeing the destruction of my home firsthand, confronting the woman who'd taken advantage of my vulnerability to impose her will on my life. Part of me wanted to avoid the confrontation, to let David handle everything professionally while I recovered somewhere else. But this was my home, my life, my boundary, that had been violated. If I didn't defend it myself, if I didn't show up to reclaim what was mine, then Diane would have won something more valuable than the ability to redecorate my house. She would have taken my power to stand up for myself. Yes, I said. I want to be there. Maya drove slowly through Portland traffic, giving me time to prepare mentally for what I was about to face. She brought clothes from her house since she wasn't sure what state my wardrobe would be in. She'd also packed snacks, water, and pain medication, knowing that the stress of the confrontation could interfere with my recovery. Whatever we find, Maya said as we turned onto my street, remember that it's all fixable. Furniture can be replaced, belongings can be recovered or replaced, and houses can be restored. What matters is that you're alive and that you're strong enough to fight for what's yours. As we pulled up to my house, I could see David's discreet black SUV parked across the street. Two of his team members were positioned where they could observe my front and back entrances. Through my living room window, I could see movement that suggested Diane was still inside, still making herself at home in my space. David approached our car as Maya parked in my driveway. He was a quiet professional man in his 40s who radiated competence and calm authority. Rachel, are you sure you're up for this? My team can handle the removal without you being present. I'm sure, I said, though my hands were shaking slightly. What's the situation? Your sister-in-law is inside with another woman she's identified as an interior designer. They appear to be continuing to make changes to the house. I've documented extensive modifications to your living space, disposal of personal property, and what appears to be ongoing renovations without the homeowner's consent. David showed me photos on his tablet that made my chest tighten with anger and grief. My beautiful home, the space I'd spent 3 years carefully crafting after my divorce, had been transformed into something completely foreign. The warm, artistic atmosphere I'd created had been replaced with a sterile, magazine-perfect aesthetic that had no connection to my personality or preferences. The designer is someone your sister-in-law hired to complete what she calls Phase 2 of your home improvement, David continued. Based on the conversation my team overheard, she's planning to completely redo your master bedroom and home office before you return from the hospital. She hired a designer? Apparently, she's using credit cards in your name, claiming she has power of attorney to make decisions about your property while you're incapacitated. The violation was deeper than I'd realized. Diane wasn't just rearranging my furniture, she was fraudulently using my credit to pay for renovations I'd never authorized. What had started as boundary violations had escalated into potential financial crimes. I want her out, I said. Now. David nodded and spoke into his radio. Team Alpha, we're going in. Homeowner is present and requesting immediate removal of unauthorized occupants. Maya helped me out of the car, and together we walked up the path to my own front door. David and one of his team members flanked us, professional and reassuring. At the door, David knocked firmly. Diane Morrison? This is David Kim with Northwest Security Services. I need to speak with you about your occupancy of this property. The door opened, and Diane appeared, looking genuinely surprised to see me standing there with security personnel. She was dressed in what I recognized as one of my silk blouses, paired with jeans that were definitely not hers. Rachel, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be in the hospital for another day. And who are these people? I'm David Kim, David said, stepping forward slightly. I represent the homeowner. Ms. Chen has requested that you vacate this property immediately. Vacate? Diane laughed, the sound high and nervous. This is a misunderstanding. I'm here helping my sister-in-law recover from surgery. I have permission to be here. Permission to water plants and check security, I said, finding my voice. Not permission to throw away my belongings, redecorate my house, and charge renovations to my credit cards. Rachel, you're not thinking clearly. The medication and the trauma of surgery are making you paranoid. Come inside and see what I've done. You'll love it once you're thinking straight. David stepped between us. Ma'am, the homeowner has clearly revoked any permission for you to be on this property. I need you to gather your belongings and leave immediately. I'm not leaving, Diane said, her voice taking on a defiant edge. Rachel needs help, and someone has to look out for her best interests. I've spent hundreds of dollars and an entire week making this place suitable for recovery. I'm not going anywhere." That's when the interior designer appeared behind Diane, a young woman in her 20s who looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation developing at the front door. Diane?" the designer said. "Maybe we should talk about this. If there's confusion about authorization for the work." "There's no confusion," Diane snapped. "I have every right to be here, and I'm making decisions that Rachel isn't capable of making right now." David pulled out his phone. "Ma'am, if you refuse to leave voluntarily, I'm going to call the Portland police to assist with your removal. The homeowner has clearly requested that you vacate the property." "Call whoever you want," Diane said, crossing her arms. "I'm not abandoning my sister-in-law when she clearly isn't capable of making rational decisions." David made the call. While we waited for police to arrive, the situation inside my house became increasingly surreal. The interior designer quickly packed up her materials and left, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to unfold. Diane, meanwhile, continued to act as though she was the victim of some misunderstanding, offering me tours of her improvements, and insisting that I would thank her once I was thinking clearly. "Look at your kitchen," she said, gesturing toward what had once been my favorite room. "I've organized everything logically, thrown away all those expired spices, and created clean lines that will help with your mental clarity during recovery." My spice collection, built over years of cooking experimentation, had been reduced to a handful of basic seasonings arranged in uniform containers. The pottery I'd collected from local artisans was gone, replaced with stark white dishes that looked like they belonged in a cafeteria. "Diane, where are my dishes? My pottery collection?" "That old stuff? Rachel, it was all mismatched and impractical. I donated it to charity. These new dishes are much more hygienic and easier to maintain." Each revelation was another small devastation. My grandmother's china, my collection of handmade bowls from local artists, the coffee mugs I'd accumulated from travel and special occasions. All gone, deemed impractical by someone who had no right to make such decisions. When the police arrived, the situation shifted from surreal to official. Officer Martinez, no relation to my surgeon, was a woman in her 30s who clearly had experience with domestic disputes and boundary violations. "Ma'am," she said to Diane after David explained the situation, "the homeowner is asking you to leave the property. Do you have legal documentation giving you the right to remain here against the owner's wishes?" "I have permission from her brother to help while she recovers from surgery," Diane said, producing her phone. "I can call him right now." "Permission from a third party doesn't override the homeowner's direct request for you to leave," Officer Martinez explained patiently. "Unless you have legal power of attorney or guardianship documentation, you need to respect the property owner's wishes." "But she's not thinking clearly. She just had surgery. She's on pain medication. Someone needs to protect her from making bad decisions." "Ma'am, unless Ms. Chen has been declared mentally incompetent by a court, she has the right to make decisions about her own property, even if others disagree with those decisions." The conversation continued for another few minutes, with Diane becoming increasingly agitated as it became clear that neither the police nor security were going to support her position. Finally, Officer Martinez gave her a choice: leave voluntarily or be escorted off the property for trespassing. Diane chose to leave, but not quietly. "Rachel, you're making a huge mistake," she said as she gathered her things. "I've spent a week of my life trying to help you, and this is how you repay me? By calling security and the police?" "You spent a week taking over my life without my permission," I replied, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "That's not help, Diane, that's control." "Fine, but when you realize what you've lost, when you see that I was only trying to help you create a better life, don't come crying to me. And don't expect James to support your paranoid delusions." As Diane loaded her car with the belongings she'd brought from Seattle, Maya stood beside me on my front porch, her hand on my shoulder for support. David and his team continued documenting the state of my house, creating a record of everything that had been changed or removed without my consent. "Are you okay?" Maya asked quietly. I looked around at my house, my sanctuary that had been transformed into someone else's vision of what my life should look like. I thought about my missing furniture, my disposed of belongings, my violated space, I was angry, sad, and exhausted. But I was also something else. "I'm free," I said finally. "For the first time in a week, I'm free." As Diane's car disappeared down my street, I walked back into my house to begin the process of reclaiming my life. The work ahead would be extensive. Furniture to replace, belongings to recover where possible, spaces to restore to reflect my personality rather than someone else's idea of improvement. But as I stood in my transformed living room, surrounded by people who respected my autonomy and supported my choices, I realized something important. Diane's invasion of my home had revealed something valuable about boundary violations and family dynamics. She'd shown me exactly how much someone could take from you if you didn't stand up for yourself, but she'd also shown me how strong I could be when defending what mattered to me. The recovery ahead wouldn't just be physical healing from surgery. It would be reclaiming my space, my possessions, and my right to live according to my own values and preferences. And I was ready for that fight. After Diane's car disappeared around the corner, the silence in my house felt different. Not peaceful, but hollow. Maya helped me settle into what had once been my living room, now arranged like a waiting room in an upscale medical office. The furniture Diane had brought in was expensive but soulless, all clean lines and neutral colors that belonged in a catalog rather than someone's home. David's team continued their documentation process, photographing every room, every change, every missing piece of my life that Diane had deemed unnecessary. The scope of what she'd done was becoming clearer with each room we examined, and it was worse than I'd initially realized. "Rachel," David said, approaching with his tablet, "we need to discuss the financial aspect of what's happened here. Based on the receipts we've found and the credit card statements your sister-in-law left on your kitchen counter, she's charged over $15,000 to your accounts for furniture, services, and renovations." $15,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. Diane hadn't just violated my space, she'd spent my money to do it. She'd used my own resources to fund the destruction of my carefully created home. "Is that legal?" Maya asked, her voice tight with anger. "No," David replied. "Using someone's credit cards without explicit authorization, especially for major purchases like furniture and contractor services, constitutes credit card fraud. The fact that she claimed to have power of attorney when she doesn't makes it even worse." I sank into one of Diane's chosen chairs, a sterile beige thing that was about as comfortable as sitting on a park bench. "What are my options?" "You can file fraud reports with your credit card companies and dispute all charges made without your authorization. You can also file a police report for credit card fraud, which could lead to criminal charges. But first, we need to document everything she purchased and verify that you never gave permission for any of these expenditures." Maya sat down beside me, her laptop already open. "I'll help you go through the statements. We'll build a case that shows exactly what Diane did and when she did it." Over the next 3 hours, we reconstructed Diane's week of helping. The credit card statements told a story that was even more disturbing than I'd imagined. She hadn't just made impulsive purchases. She'd systematically planned and executed a complete lifestyle overhaul using my money. Day 1, furniture rental and delivery services. She'd rented expensive, modern furniture to replace my eclectic mix of vintage and handmade pieces. Day 2, hiring a cleaning service to remove what she called clutter from my home. Day 3, engaging an interior designer for consultations on optimizing the space for wellness and recovery. But it was day 4 that revealed the true scope of her presumption. Diane had hired contractors to paint my home office, turning the warm burgundy walls I'd chosen into stark white. She'd had my hardwood floors refinished to remove the scuff marks and character imperfections that I'd actually loved. She'd even hired someone to remove the garden beds I'd spent 2 years establishing, replacing them with low-maintenance landscaping that required no personal involvement. "She erased you," Maya said quietly, staring at the list we'd compiled. "She systematically erased every trace of your personality and replaced it with her vision of what your life should look like." David nodded grimly. "This goes beyond overstepping boundaries. This is identity theft, fraud, and property destruction. Your sister-in-law has committed multiple felonies." The weight of that realization settled over me like a heavy blanket. Diane hadn't just been overzealous in her helping. She'd been criminal in her approach. She'd used my vulnerability as an opportunity to commit crimes against me, while wrapping them in the language of care and concern. My phone rang, interrupting the documentation process. James's name appeared on the screen, and I felt my stomach clench with dread. "Rachel, what the hell is wrong with you?" His voice was sharp with anger before I could even say hello. "Diane just called me crying. She said you had her arrested." "She wasn't arrested, James. She was asked to leave my property after I discovered that she'd spent $15,000 of my money without permission and destroyed my home." "Destroyed? She improved it. She spent her own week helping you, and this is how you repay her? By humiliating her with security guards and police?" "Her own week? James, she spent my money. $15,000 charged to my credit cards for furniture and renovations I never authorized." There was a pause. "That's impossible. Diane said she was using her own money to make improvements as a gift." "Check with your bank, James. See if $15,000 has left your accounts this week, because it sure as hell left mine." Another pause, longer this time. "Even if she used your cards, it was to help you. She was making investments in your recovery and your future happiness." "She was committing credit card fraud," I said, my voice harder than I'd intended. "And if you can't see the difference between helping and stealing, then we have bigger problems than Diane's boundary issues. You're being unreasonable. Diane loves you like a sister. Everything she did was motivated by genuine care. Love doesn't give someone the right to steal from you, James. Care doesn't give someone permission to destroy your possessions and spend your money without consent. I can't believe you're turning this into some kind of legal issue instead of just talking to her like family." I tried talking to her. She refused to listen. She told me I was being emotional and that she knew what was best for me. That's not family, James. That's control. The conversation continued for another few minutes, with James alternately defending Diane's actions and minimizing their impact. It became clear that he was either unwilling or unable to see what his wife had actually done. In his mind, Diane's intentions justified her methods, and my objections were just post-surgical confusion. "James," I said finally, "I need you to understand something. If Diane had asked my permission before making any of these changes, if she had respected my wishes when I asked her to stop, if she had used her own money instead of mine, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But she didn't do any of those things. She decided she knew better than I did about my own life, and she took actions that violated my autonomy, my privacy, and my financial security. She was trying to help you heal. She was trying to control me. And until you can acknowledge the difference, I don't think we have anything more to discuss." I hung up before James could respond, feeling exhausted and emotionally drained. Maya reached over and squeezed my hand. "You did the right thing," she said. "Setting boundaries isn't mean or unreasonable. It's necessary." David looked up from his tablet where he'd been reviewing the documentation his team had compiled. "Rachel, I need to ask you something important. Do you want to pursue criminal charges against Diane for the credit card fraud and property destruction?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Pursuing criminal charges would mean escalating this family conflict into something that could never be undone. It would mean potentially sending James's wife to prison, destroying their marriage, and severing whatever remained of my relationship with my brother. But it would also mean holding Diane accountable for her actions and establishing clear consequences for what she'd done to me. "What would that process look like?" I asked. "We'd work with the Portland police to file formal charges for credit card fraud, identity theft, and destruction of personal property. Given the amount of money involved and the deliberate nature of her actions, these would be felony charges. If convicted, she could face significant jail time and be required to pay restitution for all damages." Maya leaned forward. "Rachel, I know this is hard because she's family, but think about what happens if there are no consequences. What message does that send to Diane? What happens the next time she decides someone needs her help?" "And think about other people," David added. "If Diane has done this to you, she's probably done it to others, or will do it in the future. Sometimes criminal charges are the only way to stop a pattern of behavior. I thought about Diane's history of involvement in other people's lives, her tendency to offer unsolicited advice and unwanted help. I thought about her work in real estate, where she had access to people's homes and personal information. I thought about her complete lack of remorse when confronted with what she'd done to me. "Let me think about it," I said. "Right now, I just want to focus on getting my life back." "That's fair," David said. "But don't wait too long. There are time limits on filing these kinds of charges, and evidence can disappear if people know they're being investigated." The rest of the afternoon was spent cataloging what had been lost or destroyed. My grandmother's antique dresser, donated to charity without my knowledge. My collection of first edition art books, thrown away because Diane considered them outdated. My handmade pottery from local artists, replaced with mass-produced dishes because they were more practical. Each item represented more than just monetary value. They were pieces of my identity, connections to my family history, memories of travels and experiences that had shaped who I was. Diane had looked at these treasures and seen clutter, problems to be solved, obstacles to her vision of what my life should look like. "We can try to track down some of the donated items," Maya suggested as we worked through the list. "Charity organizations usually keep records of what they receive." "Maybe," I said, though I wasn't hopeful. "But even if we find them, they'll never be the same. Someone else will have owned them, used them, changed them. The connection will be broken." David's phone buzzed with a message from one of his team members who was investigating the contractors Diane had hired. "Rachel, we've got a problem. The landscaping company that removed your garden beds? They were hired to dig up and dispose of what Diane told them were, quote, diseased plants that posed a health hazard." "What does that mean?" "It means your garden isn't just gone. It's been contaminated with chemicals designed to prevent anything from growing there for years. She didn't just remove your plants. She made sure you couldn't replace them." The news hit me harder than I expected. My garden had been my sanctuary within my sanctuary, the place where I went to think and create and find peace. I'd spent 2 years carefully selecting plants that would thrive in Portland's climate, creating a space that brought me joy every time I looked out my kitchen window. "Why would she do that?" Maya asked, her voice reflecting the bewilderment I felt. "Because she wanted to make sure her changes were permanent," David said. "She wanted to make it as difficult as possible for you to undo what she'd done." That evening, after David's team had finished their documentation and left for the day, Maya and I sat in my transformed kitchen eating takeout from containers, because Diane had disposed of my everyday dishes, and the new ones she'd purchased felt too sterile to actually use. "What are you going to do about James?" Maya asked. "I don't know. He's chosen to believe Diane's version of events, and I can't force him to see the truth. Maybe he genuinely can't see it, or maybe he doesn't want to see it because acknowledging what she did would require him to take action he's not prepared to take. It's possible he's been dealing with this kind of behavior from Diane for years and has learned to rationalize it as normal." I thought about James and Diane's relationship, the way he'd gradually seemed to lose his own voice in decisions about their life together. When they'd first married, James had been decisive and confident. Over the years, I'd watched him become more passive, more willing to defer to Diane's preferences and opinions. "Maybe she's been practicing on him," I said. "Learning how to override someone's autonomy by convincing them it's for their own good." My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Rachel, this is Patricia Hawkins from Hawkins Interior Design. I'm the designer Diane hired to work on your house. I wanted to reach out personally to apologize for my involvement in what happened. I was told you had approved all the work and were temporarily unable to communicate due to medical treatment. I realize now that wasn't true, and I want to make things right. Please call me when you're ready to discuss how we can restore your home." The message was a surprise. I'd expected the designer to disappear and hoped the whole situation went away, not reach out to offer assistance. "That's encouraging," Maya said when I showed her the text. At least someone involved has a conscience. I called Patricia immediately, and her first words were an apology. Ms. Chen, I am so sorry for my role in what happened to your home. When Diane contacted me, she presented herself as your healthcare proxy with full authority to make decisions about your living environment. She had documentation that appeared to give her the right to act on your behalf. What kind of documentation? Papers that looked like power of attorney forms, medical directives, that sort of thing. I've been in this business for 10 years, and I've worked with family members making decisions for incapacitated relatives before. I thought this was a similar situation, but those documents were fake? I've since learned that she had no legal authority to make the decisions she claimed to be authorized to make. I've also learned that you never consented to any of the work that was done in your home. Patricia explained that she'd become suspicious when Diane had insisted on making dramatic changes that seemed inconsistent with the homeowner's existing style and preferences. When she'd questioned these choices, Diane had claimed that I was going through a life transition and wanted a completely fresh start. She was very convincing. Patricia continued. She talked about your medical crisis as a wake-up call that made you want to simplify your life and embrace a more minimalist aesthetic. She said you'd specifically requested that all traces of your old life be removed. And you believed that? I wanted to believe it because the alternative was that I was participating in something unethical. But when your security team showed up today and I saw your poor reaction to what had been done to your house, I realized I'd been manipulated into participating in something that was never legitimate. Patricia offered to work with me at no charge to help restore my home to something closer to its original state. She'd taken photographs of everything before beginning work and could help me identify what had been removed or changed. She also offered to testify about Diane's deception if I decided to pursue legal action. There's something else you should know, Patricia said. Diane mentioned that she was planning similar, quote, interventions for other family members who she felt needed guidance in their living situations. I got the impression that this wasn't the first time she'd taken it upon herself to improve someone's life without their permission. After ending the call with Patricia, I felt a mix of validation and concern. Validation because her testimony confirmed that Diane had deliberately deceived multiple professionals to accomplish her takeover of my home. Concern because Patricia's warning suggested that other people might be experiencing similar violations. We need to warn people, Maya said when I told her about the conversation. If Diane has a pattern of this behavior, there might be other victims who don't know how to fight back. That night, I lay in the hospital-style bed Diane had chosen for me, staring at the ceiling of my transformed bedroom. The warm, cozy space I'd created over 3 years had been turned into something that looked like a recovery room in an expensive rehabilitation facility. Even the artwork on the walls had been replaced with generic, inspirational prints that belonged in a therapist's office. But as I lay there surrounded by Diane's version of what my life should look like, I felt something unexpected. Determination. She'd shown me exactly how much damage someone could do when they convinced themselves they knew what was best for another person. She'd demonstrated the importance of having strong boundaries and the courage to defend them. More importantly, she'd revealed something about my own strength that I might never have discovered otherwise. When faced with a systematic attack on my autonomy and identity, I'd found the courage to fight back. I'd stood up to family pressure, involved professionals when necessary, and refused to be gaslit into accepting unacceptable behavior. The next morning brought a call from my credit card company's fraud department. They had received my dispute reports and were launching an investigation into the unauthorized charges on my accounts. The representative assured me that I wouldn't be held responsible for charges I hadn't authorized, and that they would work with law enforcement if criminal charges were filed. Ms. Chen, the representative said, I want you to know that this is one of the most extensive cases of unauthorized family use we've seen. The deliberate nature of these charges and the amounts involved make this a serious criminal matter. Maya arrived that morning with coffee and a plan. She'd spent the night researching Diane's background and had discovered some disturbing information. Diane's real estate license was suspended 2 years ago for what the board called, quote, boundary violations with clients, Maya reported, reading from her laptop screen. Apparently, she was entering clients' homes without permission and making changes she claimed would help with sales. Changes like what? Rearranging furniture, removing personal items she considered clutter, even painting rooms without authorization. Several clients filed complaints, but the board only suspended her license for 6 months. So she has a history of this. It gets worse. I found 3 other complaints filed with the Seattle Better Business Bureau from people who claimed Diane had overstepped her authority while providing real estate services. One woman said Diane had donated her furniture to charity while claiming to be preparing the house for sale. The pattern was clear. Diane's invasion of my home wasn't an isolated incident born from misguided concern about my recovery. It was part of a long-standing pattern of behavior where she appointed herself the judge of other people's life choices and took action to correct what she perceived as their mistakes. "Rachel," Maya said carefully, "I think you need to file criminal charges. This woman is predatory, and she's going to keep doing this to other people, unless there are serious consequences." Before I could respond, my phone rang. James was calling again, and his voice was different this time, strained and worried. "Rachel, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Did Diane really spend $15,000 of your money without permission?" "Yes, James. I showed you the credit card statements. I checked our accounts. No money left our accounts this week, which means—" He trailed off, the implications sinking in. "Which means she was lying when she told you she was using her own money to improve my house." There was a long silence before James spoke again. "Rachel, I think I need to come down there. There are some things we need to talk about, and I think I owe you an apology." "What changed your mind?" "After you hung up yesterday, I started thinking about some things Diane has done over the years. Things I rationalized or ignored because they seemed minor. But when I add them all up, and then I look at what happened to your house—" Another pause. "I think my wife might have serious problems." James arrived in Portland that afternoon, and the conversation we had changed everything I thought I understood about Diane's behavior and my brother's marriage. We sat in my transformed living room, surrounded by evidence of his wife's systematic violation of my life, and James told me stories that made my situation seem like just the latest escalation in a long pattern of controlling behavior. "It started small," James said, his voice heavy with a guilt I'd never heard before. "Little things. Like rearranging my home office because she said it would make me more productive. Or throwing away clothes she didn't like because they didn't project the right image." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because she always had good reasons. She was trying to help me advance in my career or improve my health or strengthen our relationship, and the changes she made were usually improvements, objectively speaking. Better furniture, more organized spaces, healthier food choices. But they weren't your choices." "No, they weren't. But I convinced myself that didn't matter because the results were positive." James described years of gradual erosion of his autonomy, each incident small enough to seem reasonable in isolation, but collectively representing a complete takeover of his decision-making power. Diane had chosen their house, their neighborhood, their social circle, even their vacation destinations, always with explanations about why her choices were better than his preferences. "She's been planning this intervention with you for months," James admitted. "Ever since your divorce, she's been talking about how concerned she was about your lifestyle, your living situation, your social isolation. She said you needed guidance to make better choices for your health and happiness." "And you went along with that?" "I thought she was just being caring. I didn't realize she was planning to take action without your consent." The picture that emerged from our conversation was of a woman who had systematically taken control of her husband's life through incremental boundary violations, then turned her attention to extending that control to his family members. My medical crisis had provided the perfect opportunity for her to implement her plans for improving my life. "James," I said carefully, "what's your marriage like day to day? Who makes the decisions about your life?" His answer was telling. Diane chose their meals, their social plans, their financial priorities, even James's work schedule when possible. She'd convinced him that her management of these details was a gift that freed him to focus on more important things. But the reality was that James had gradually stopped having any say in the day-to-day reality of his own life. "I love her," James said, "but I'm starting to realize that love isn't the same thing as accepting someone's need to control everything around them." "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to defend her because she's my wife and because I know her intentions are good. But another part of me is angry that she lied to me about using your money, and that she put me in the position of defending behavior I didn't fully understand. We spent the rest of the afternoon going through my house room by room, with James seeing firsthand the extent of what Diane had done. His reaction was a mix of shock and recognition. Shock at the scope of the changes, and recognition of the controlling patterns he'd been living with for years. "She does the same thing to our house," he said, standing in my transformed kitchen. "Every few months, she decides something needs to be improved, and she makes changes without discussing them with me. I wake up one morning and my office is rearranged, or my clothes have been reorganized, or she's thrown away something she decided I didn't need. And you never objected?" I tried at first, but she always had explanations for why her way was better, and frankly, she was usually right about the practical benefits. It was easier to go along with it than to fight about it. But easier for who? James looked around my kitchen, taking in the sterile efficiency Diane had created where my warm, personal space used to be. Easier for her. I see that now. That evening, James called Diane to tell her he was staying in Portland for a few days to help me deal with the aftermath of her intervention. The conversation I overheard was revealing in its one-sidedness. James mostly listened while Diane talked, occasionally trying to interject with questions or objections that were quickly overwhelmed by her explanations and justifications. "She wants to come back down here," James told me after hanging up. "She says she needs to finish what she started and help you understand why the changes she made are actually good for you. Absolutely not." That's what I told her, but she's insisting that you're not thinking clearly because of the medication and the trauma of surgery. She thinks if she can just explain her reasoning, you'll appreciate what she did. "James, your wife committed multiple felonies. She stole my money, destroyed my property, and violated my home. There's no explanation that makes those actions acceptable. I know that. I'm just telling you what she said." "What did you say?" "I told her that she needed to stay in Seattle and give you space to recover. I told her that coming back to Portland would only make things worse." "And her response?" "She accused me of being manipulated by you and said that I was abandoning my responsibility to protect family members who couldn't protect themselves." The conversation revealed everything I needed to know about Diane's mindset. In her view, I was incompetent to make decisions about my own life, and anyone who supported my autonomy was either manipulated or irresponsible. She genuinely believed that she had the right and responsibility to override my choices for my own good. "James, I need to ask you something difficult. If I pursue criminal charges against Diane, will you support me?" He was quiet for a long time before answering. "Yes. It's going to destroy my marriage, but yes. What she did was criminal, and there need to be consequences. It doesn't have to destroy your marriage. It could be the beginning of setting healthy boundaries that allow your relationship to function without control and manipulation. Maybe, but I don't think Diane is capable of accepting boundaries. I think she genuinely believes that her way of managing people's lives is better than letting them make their own choices." The next morning, I called David to tell him I was ready to file criminal charges against Diane. The decision felt both necessary and heartbreaking. Necessary because her behavior was criminal and likely to continue. Heartbreaking because it would irrevocably change my relationship with my brother and potentially destroy his marriage. "Are you sure about this?" David asked. "Once we file these charges, there's no going back. This becomes a criminal matter that will follow Diane for the rest of her life." "I'm sure. What she did to me was just the latest in a pattern of violations that she'll continue unless there are serious consequences." David explained the process. We would file complaints with the Portland police for credit card fraud, identity theft, and destruction of personal property. The district attorney's office would review the evidence and decide whether to prosecute. Given the amount of money involved and the deliberate nature of Diane's actions, prosecution was likely. "There's one more thing," David said. "Based on what you've told me about Diane's history with other clients and family members, the authorities might want to investigate whether there are other victims. This could become a much larger case. That afternoon, James and I went to the Portland police station to file formal complaints against Diane. Detective Sarah Morrison, who specialized in financial crimes, took our statements and reviewed the evidence David's team had compiled. "This is one of the most comprehensive cases of family financial abuse I've seen," Detective Morrison said after reviewing the documentation. "The deliberate nature of these crimes and the amount of money involved make this a serious felony case." "What happens next?" James asked. "We'll issue a warrant for Mrs. Diane Morrison's arrest. Given that she lives in Washington, we'll coordinate with Seattle police to execute the warrant. She'll be extradited to Oregon to face charges here." James looked stricken at the mention of his wife's arrest, but he nodded. "She needs to face consequences for what she did." Detective Morrison looked at James with sympathy. "Mr. Chen, I know this is difficult because she's your wife, but I want you to understand that what she did to your sister represents a serious pattern of criminal behavior. People who commit these kinds of violations rarely stop on their own." That evening, James and I had dinner at a restaurant near my house, both of us emotionally exhausted from the day's events. "Are you okay with what we did today?" I asked. "No," James said honestly, "but I'm okay with it being the right thing to do." "There is a difference." "What will you do when she's arrested?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to bail her out and try to get her help. Another part of me thinks that would just be enabling her behavior again." "You could do both. You could support her getting help while still holding her accountable for what she did." "Maybe. But first, she has to acknowledge that what she did was wrong, and I'm not sure she's capable of that level of self-reflection." 2 days later, Detective Morrison called to inform us that Diane had been arrested in Seattle and would be transported to Portland to face charges. The news felt surreal. My sister-in-law was now a criminal defendant because of her need to control my life during my medical crisis. "How did she react to the arrest?" I asked. According to the Seattle officers, she was shocked and maintained that she was being persecuted for trying to help a family member. She insisted that all charges were based on misunderstandings and that you would withdraw them once you were thinking clearly. Even in custody, Diane remained convinced that she was the victim of the situation rather than its perpetrator. Her inability to acknowledge the legitimacy of my objections to her behavior suggested that James was right about her capacity for self-reflection. Over the following days, I began the process of restoring my home and my life. Patricia, the interior designer, worked with me to identify pieces that could be recovered and spaces that could be restored. Some things would never be the same. My grandmother's dresser was gone forever. My garden would take years to recover. But slowly, my house began to feel like home again. James extended his stay in Portland to help with the restoration and to deal with the legal proceedings involving his wife. Our relationship, damaged by years of his passive acceptance of Diane's boundary violations, began to heal as we worked together to undo the damage she'd caused. "I owe you an apology," James said one evening as we painted over the stark white walls Diane had chosen for my office. "I should have seen what she was doing to you, and I should have stopped her." "You couldn't stop something you didn't recognize," I said. "She's very skilled at making control look like care. But I should have recognized it. I've been living with it for years." The process of filing criminal charges against Diane had forced James to confront the reality of his marriage and his own complicity in her controlling behavior. It was painful for him, but also liberating in ways he was just beginning to understand. 3 weeks after Diane's arrest, I was back to work at my design agency, my health mostly recovered from the surgery. My house was slowly returning to something that felt like home, though it would never be exactly the same as before Diane's intervention. But in some ways, that was appropriate. I wasn't exactly the same person I'd been before my medical crisis and its aftermath. I'd learned things about boundaries, family dynamics, and my own strength that had changed how I saw myself and my relationships. Diane's invasion of my home had been devastating, but it had also been educational. She'd shown me exactly what could happen when someone decided they knew better than you did about your own life. She demonstrated the importance of standing up for yourself, even when the people you love don't understand or support your position. Most importantly, she'd revealed that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, capable of fighting for what mattered to me even when that fight came at great personal cost. The criminal case against Diane was still pending, but the outcome was less important to me than the process had been. Filing charges had been about establishing that there were consequences for violating another person's autonomy, even when those violations were motivated by claimed good intentions. As I sat in my restored office, working on a design project for a client who appreciated my aesthetic vision, I reflected on how much had changed since that morning when I'd woken up in the hospital to find my life taken over by someone who thought she knew better than I did about how I should live. Diane had believed she was saving me from myself, rescuing me from poor choices, and setting me on a path toward better health and happiness. In reality, she'd shown me that I was perfectly capable of saving myself, making my own choices, and creating a life that reflected my values, rather than someone else's vision of what my life should be. The best revenge, I'd learned, wasn't pursuing punishment for its own sake. It was reclaiming your power, rebuilding your life according to your own vision, and making sure that the people who tried to control you understood that their approval wasn't necessary for your happiness. Diane would face the legal consequences of her actions, but I'd already achieved the victory that mattered most. I'd defended my right to live my own life, on my own terms, in my own space. And that victory belonged entirely to me. The call from Detective Morrison came on a rainy Thursday morning 6 weeks after Diane's arrest. I was in my restored home office, finally feeling productive again in a space that reflected my personality rather than someone else's vision of optimal wellness. Rachel, I wanted to give you an update on the case. Diane's attorney has approached the district attorney about a plea agreement. I set down my coffee, preparing myself for whatever was coming next. What kind of plea agreement? She's willing to plead guilty to the credit card fraud charges, in exchange for dropping the identity theft and property destruction charges. She'd serve 18 months in minimum security prison and pay full restitution for all financial damages. 18 months. It seemed both too little and too much. Too little for someone who'd systematically dismantled my life while I was vulnerable. Too much for a woman whose worst crime might have been carrying too much in the wrong way. What's the alternative if she doesn't take the plea? If we go to trial on all charges and win, she could face up to 8 years in state prison. But trials are unpredictable, especially when the defendant is a middle-class woman with no prior criminal record who claims her actions were motivated by concern for a family member. Detective Morrison explained that the prosecution was recommending I consider the plea agreement because it guaranteed consequences for Diane's actions, while avoiding the uncertainty and emotional toll of a trial. A plea would also mean Diane had to formally acknowledge guilt for her crimes rather than maintaining her innocence. I need some time to think about it, I said. Of course. Take as much time as you need. I'll call you back in a few days. After hanging up, I sat in my office looking out at the garden space where new growth was slowly emerging from the chemical damage Diane had inflicted. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Recovery from violation took time, but it was possible if you were patient and persistent. My phone buzzed with a text from James. Can we talk? Diane's lawyer called me about the plea agreement. James had been staying in Portland on and off since Diane's arrest, ostensibly to help with my recovery, but really to avoid dealing with the reality of his marriage. He'd rented a small apartment downtown and was working remotely while he figured out what came next in his relationship with his wife. Come over, I texted back. We need to discuss this together. An hour later, James sat in my living room looking more exhausted than I'd seen him since the whole ordeal began. The past 6 weeks had aged him in ways that went beyond just physical appearance. He'd been forced to confront the reality that his marriage was built on patterns of control and manipulation that he'd spent years rationalizing. Her lawyer thinks the plea agreement is a good deal, James said without preamble. 18 months is manageable, and it avoids the risk of a longer sentence if she's convicted at trial. What does Diane think? She's angry. She still maintains that she was trying to help you, and that accepting a guilty plea means admitting to crimes she doesn't believe she committed. I poured James a cup of coffee and settled into the chair across from him. What do you think? I think she needs to accept responsibility for what she did, and if a guilty plea is the only way that happens, then that's what needs to happen. James looked around my living room, which I'd spent weeks restoring to something that felt like home again. Most of my original furniture was gone forever, but I'd found pieces that honored my aesthetic while acknowledging that some things couldn't be exactly as they were before. Rachel, there's something else I need to tell you. I filed for divorce. The news shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. Despite everything that had happened, part of me had expected James to try to make his marriage work through counseling or therapy, or some other intervention that might address Diane's controlling behavior. How are you feeling about that decision? Terrified and relieved in equal measure. Terrified because Diane has been managing my life for so long that I'm not sure I remember how to make decisions for myself. Relieved because I won't have to spend the rest of my life apologizing for her behavior or defending actions I don't actually support. James explained that the process of watching Diane's reaction to being held accountable for her crimes had been a revelation. Instead of acknowledging the harm she'd caused, she'd doubled down on her justifications and expanded her narrative to include James and me as conspirators against her good intentions. "She's convinced that you manipulated me into turning against her," James said. "In her mind, our entire family has been brainwashed into believing that her helpful actions were somehow criminal. Does she show any remorse at all? None. She's angry that she's facing consequences, but she's not sorry for what she did. If anything, she seems more convinced than ever, that she was right to intervene in your life." The conversation was interrupted by my doorbell. Maya stood on my porch holding a bottle of wine and wearing an expression that suggested she had news. "Am I interrupting something important?" she asked, noticing James's serious expression. "Actually, your timing is perfect," I said. "We're discussing Diane's plea agreement, and I could use your perspective." Maya had been following the case closely and had strong opinions about accountability and consequences. As my business partner and closest friend, she'd seen firsthand how Diane's violations had affected both my personal recovery and my professional productivity. "What are the terms?" Maya asked after I explained the plea agreement. 18 months in minimum security prison, full financial restitution, and a guilty plea to credit card fraud. And if she doesn't take it, up to 8 years if convicted at trial, but the risk that she might be acquitted or receive a lighter sentence. Maya was quiet for a moment, considering the options. "What does your gut tell you?" "That 18 months isn't enough time for someone who systematically destroyed another person's life while they were vulnerable, but also that forcing her to plead guilty and acknowledge criminal wrongdoing might be more important than the length of her sentence." "What about the message it sends?" James asked. "If Diane only serves 18 months for what she did, does that tell other people that this kind of behavior isn't really that serious?" It was a fair question. Part of the value of criminal prosecution was deterrent effect, both for the defendant and for others who might be considering similar actions. A short sentence might suggest that violating someone's autonomy during a medical crisis was a minor offense, rather than a serious crime. Maya leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Rachel, I think the most important question is, what do you need to feel like justice has been served?" I'd been asking myself that question for weeks without arriving at a clear answer. Justice felt like an abstract concept when applied to family relationships and boundary violations. Diane's crimes had measurable financial components, but the deeper harm was psychological and relational, in ways that couldn't be quantified or easily repaired. "I need her to acknowledge that what she did was wrong," I said finally. "I need her to understand that good intentions don't justify violating someone's autonomy. And I need to know that there are consequences serious enough to prevent her from doing this to other people." "Do you think 18 months in prison accomplishes those goals?" "The prison time might, but only if she uses that time to genuinely reflect on her behavior rather than just feeling sorry for herself." James shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Based on her reaction so far, I don't think Diane is capable of that kind of self-reflection. She's more likely to spend 18 months feeling like a victim of the system than examining her own actions." That was the heart of the problem. Diane's crimes weren't born from malice or greed, but from a fundamental inability to respect other people's autonomy and decision-making capacity. She genuinely believed that her judgment was superior to that of the people she claimed to be helping, and prison time alone wasn't likely to change that worldview. "Maybe that's not our responsibility," Maya said gently. Maybe our responsibility is just to ensure that there are consequences for her actions, and her personal growth or lack thereof is up to her. My phone rang, interrupting our discussion. The caller ID showed Patricia Hawkins, the interior designer who'd been helping me restore my home. Rachel, I hope I'm not calling at a bad time, but I wanted to let you know about something that might be relevant to Diane's case. What is it? I've been contacted by 2 other women who say Diane did similar things to their homes. They saw the news coverage of her arrest and reached out to me because they recognized the pattern of behavior. Patricia explained that both women had hired Diane through her real estate business to help prepare their homes for sale. In both cases, Diane had exceeded her authority by making dramatic changes to their living spaces without permission, claiming that her modifications were necessary for successful sales. One woman said Diane rearranged her entire house and donated furniture she claimed was dated to charity. The other said Diane hired contractors to repaint rooms and remove wallpaper without authorization, then billed the homeowner for services she'd never requested. Are they willing to testify about their experiences? Yes, and they're also considering filing their own criminal complaints. Apparently, Diane's pattern of behavior goes back several years and involves multiple victims. After ending the call with Patricia, I shared the information with James and Maya. The revelation that Diane had a longer history of boundary violations with multiple victims changed the calculus around her plea agreement. If there are other victims, this becomes about more than just what happened to you, Maya pointed out. This becomes about stopping a pattern of predatory behavior. James looked stricken. How many people has she hurt? How many times have I defended her when she was actually victimizing someone? You couldn't have known, I said, though I could see the guilt eating at him. She was careful to present her actions as helpful rather than harmful. But I should have questioned her version of events. I should have been more skeptical when people complained about her behavior. The discovery of additional victims reinforced my inclination to reject the plea agreement and push for a trial that would expose the full scope of Diane's pattern of violations. If she'd been systematically taking advantage of vulnerable people for years, 18 months seemed inadequate as both punishment and deterrent. That evening, I called Detective Morrison to discuss the new information Patricia had provided. We're aware of the other potential victims, Detective Morrison said. We've been investigating Diane's background since her arrest, and we've identified at least 4 other people who may have been targeted by similar schemes. Why wasn't I told about this earlier? We wanted to verify the claims before discussing them with you, but now that we've confirmed a pattern of behavior, the district attorney is reconsidering the plea agreement. Detective Morrison explained that the discovery of multiple victims had strengthened the prosecution's case significantly. Instead of an isolated incident involving family dysfunction, Diane's actions appeared to be part of a long-term pattern of targeting vulnerable people and violating their autonomy for her own psychological gratification. What does this mean for the plea negotiations? The district attorney is likely to withdraw the current offer and seek more serious charges. With multiple victims and a clear pattern of predatory behavior, we're looking at potential sentences in the 5 to 10-year range. The next morning brought a call from Diane's attorney requesting a meeting with me to discuss the case. Attorney Michelle Roberts was a woman in her 50s who specialized in defending white-collar criminals and had a reputation for negotiating favorable plea agreements for clients whose crimes were motivated by personal rather than financial factors. Ms. Chen, I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. I know this situation has been incredibly difficult for you and your family. What did you want to discuss? My client is facing significantly more serious charges now that additional victims have come forward. I want to explore whether there's still an opportunity for a resolution that serves everyone's interests. Michelle Roberts explained that Diane was beginning to understand the seriousness of her situation and was considering accepting responsibility for her actions if it meant avoiding a lengthy prison sentence. What kind of responsibility? Full acknowledgement of wrongdoing, genuine apology to all victims, completion of extensive counseling to address the underlying issues that led to her behavior, and community service focused on helping other people who've experienced similar violations. And in exchange? A plea agreement that results in 2 to 3 years in prison followed by supervised probation, with strict conditions about respecting other people's boundaries and autonomy. The offer was more appealing than the original 18-month proposal, but I wasn't sure it was adequate given the scope of Diane's crimes and the number of people she'd harmed. "I need to think about it," I said, "and I need to speak with the other victims to understand their perspectives." "Of course. But I hope you'll consider that my client is finally recognizing the harm she's caused and is genuinely interested in making amends." After ending the call, I spent the afternoon reaching out to the other women who'd been victimized by Diane's boundary violations. Their stories were remarkably similar to mine: a vulnerable person in need of help, Diane inserting herself into their situation, and systematic violations justified by claims of good intentions. Sarah Martinez had hired Diane to help sell her deceased mother's house and had returned from her mother's funeral to find that Diane had emptied the house of furniture and personal items she claimed would interfere with potential sales. She threw away photo albums, personal letters, jewelry that had been in my family for generations, Sarah told me during our phone conversation. When I confronted her, she said she was helping me avoid the emotional burden of sorting through painful memories. Linda Thompson had engaged Diane's services when she was going through a difficult divorce and needed to prepare her house for sale quickly. Diane had convinced Linda to sign papers giving her temporary authority to make minor repairs and staging adjustments, then had used that authority to completely redecorate the house and bill Linda for thousands of dollars in unauthorized improvements. She said my home reflected depression and low self-esteem, and that potential buyers would be turned off by the negative energy, Linda explained. She claimed she was helping me start fresh with a more positive living environment. Each woman's story revealed the same pattern. Diane identified vulnerable people going through difficult transitions, convinced them to give her limited authority to help, then systematically exceeded that authority while claiming her actions were motivated by care and concern. "What do you think about the plea agreement?" I asked each of them. All three women shared my ambivalence. They wanted Diane to face serious consequences for her actions, but they also wanted to avoid the uncertainty and emotional toll of a trial. Most importantly, they wanted Diane to acknowledge the harm she'd caused and take steps to ensure she never victimized anyone else. "I don't care how long she goes to prison," Sarah said. "I care that she understands what she took from me can never be replaced." Those photo albums contained the only pictures I had of my grandparents. The jewelry she threw away had been passed down through 4 generations of women in my family. Her need to help me process grief destroyed connections to my family history that I'll never recover. Over the next few days, I consulted with victim advocates, legal experts, and counselors who specialized in boundary violations and psychological abuse. The consensus was that Diane's pattern of behavior represented a serious psychological disorder that required intensive treatment, but that treatment was only effective if the person acknowledged their problems and genuinely committed to change. People who engage in this kind of controlling behavior often lack empathy and have difficulty recognizing other people's autonomy, explained Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who specialized in treating people with control disorders. Prison time alone rarely changes these patterns unless it's combined with intensive therapy and strict long-term supervision. Is Diane likely to benefit from therapy? That depends entirely on her willingness to acknowledge that her behavior is problematic. If she continues to believe that her actions were justified, therapy will be ineffective regardless of how long she participates. A week later, I met with all 3 other victims, Detective Morrison and the district attorney, to discuss our collective response to Diane's latest plea offer. District Attorney Rachel Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, was a man in his 40s who'd built his career prosecuting financial crimes and had strong opinions about deterrent effects and victim rights. "This case has received significant media attention," DA Chen explained. "Our decision about plea negotiations will send a message about how seriously our jurisdiction takes crimes that target vulnerable people during medical crises or family emergencies. What's your recommendation?" Linda asked. "I think we should reject the plea offer and go to trial." Diane's pattern of behavior represents a serious threat to public safety, and 2 to 3 years in prison isn't adequate punishment for someone who's systematically victimized vulnerable people over several years. Sarah disagreed. "I don't want to spend months reliving what happened to me in a courtroom. If she's willing to plead guilty and acknowledge wrongdoing, that might be more important than the length of her sentence." The discussion continued for over an hour, with each victim expressing different priorities and concerns. Ultimately, we agreed that our decision should be based on what was most likely to prevent Diane from victimizing other people in the future. "The question," Chen said, "is whether we believe Diane is capable of genuine change, or whether she's simply trying to minimize her prison time while maintaining her belief that her actions were justified." To answer that question, Chen arranged for Diane to undergo a psychological evaluation by an independent expert who would assess her capacity for acknowledging wrongdoing and committing to behavioral change. Dr. Amanda Foster was a forensic psychologist with extensive experience evaluating defendants in cases involving boundary violations and psychological abuse. Her evaluation of Diane would determine whether the plea negotiations could move forward or whether the case should proceed to trial. 2 weeks later, Dr. Foster's report arrived, and its conclusions were sobering. While Diane had no diagnosable mental illness that would excuse her behavior, she demonstrated significant narcissistic traits and an inability to empathize with her victims' perspectives. The defendant continues to maintain that her actions were motivated by genuine care for the people she claims to have helped, Dr. Foster wrote. "She shows no understanding of how her behavior violated her victims' autonomy and caused significant psychological harm. Her expressions of regret focus on the consequences she's facing rather than the harm she caused others." Most damning was Dr. Foster's conclusion about Diane's likelihood of reoffending. Without intensive long-term therapy and strict supervision, the defendant is highly likely to engage in similar boundary violations if given the opportunity. Her fundamental belief that she knows better than others about their life choices has not been altered by her arrest or the prospect of imprisonment. After reviewing the psychological evaluation, I called James to discuss its implications for our family and for Diane's future. "She's not going to change, is she?" James asked after I summarized Dr. Foster's findings. "Not unless she acknowledges that her behavior is problematic, and according to the psychologist, she's nowhere near that level of self-awareness. Then the plea agreement is pointless. If she's not genuinely sorry and she's likely to do this to other people, she needs to face the full consequences of her actions." James's position represented a significant evolution from his initial impulse to defend his wife and minimize her crimes. The psychological evaluation had forced him to confront the reality that Diane's need to control other people was a fundamental part of her personality rather than an isolated response to my medical crisis. That afternoon, I called the other victims to share Dr. Foster's conclusions and discuss our collective response to the plea negotiations. "I'm done trying to help her avoid consequences," Sarah said after hearing about Diane's continued refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing. "If she can't understand what she did wrong, she's going to keep doing it to other people." Linda agreed. "I was willing to consider a plea agreement if she showed genuine remorse and committed to getting help. But if she's just trying to minimize her punishment while maintaining that she was right to violate our boundaries, then she needs to face trial." 3 days later, our collective decision was communicated to Chen. We were rejecting the plea agreement and requesting that the case proceed to trial on all charges. Our priority was ensuring that Diane faced consequences serious enough to deter similar behavior, and that the legal proceedings created a clear public record of accountability for boundary violations. The trial was scheduled for 3 months later, giving both sides time to prepare their cases and for me to continue my recovery from both the surgery and its aftermath. As the trial date approached, I found myself thinking less about revenge or punishment and more about closure and prevention. Diane's invasion of my home had taught me valuable lessons about boundaries, family dynamics, and my own capacity for standing up to people who claimed to know what was best for me. The legal proceedings had forced difficult conversations with James about enabling behavior and family loyalty. Most importantly, the discovery of other victims had revealed that my situation wasn't isolated but part of a pattern that needed to be stopped. The trial itself was less dramatic than I'd expected. Diane's attorney tried to portray her as a caring family member whose good intentions had been criminalized by an ungrateful sister-in-law and a prosecution-hungry district attorney. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the testimony from multiple victims established a clear pattern of predatory behavior. Diane took the stand in her own defense, and her testimony was revealing in its complete lack of genuine remorse. She maintained that all her actions had been motivated by love and concern, and that her victims were simply too emotional or confused to appreciate the improvements she'd made to their lives. I spent my own vacation time helping Rachel recover from surgery, Diane testified. I researched the best practices for post-surgical environments and implemented changes that would optimize her healing. If she's unhappy with the results, that's her choice, but I acted out of love and with her best interests in mind. When cross-examined about using my credit cards without permission, Diane claimed she'd assumed I would want her to use whatever resources were necessary to create the best possible recovery environment. Rachel is my sister-in-law, and I love her like family. I knew she would want me to do whatever was necessary to help her heal, and I assumed she would be grateful for my efforts once she was thinking clearly. Her testimony about the other victims followed the same pattern. She'd identified people who needed help, provided services they were too emotional or confused to request themselves, and expected gratitude rather than complaints about boundary violations. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Diane was sentenced to 6 years in state prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, with strict conditions about respecting other people's autonomy and boundaries. At the sentencing hearing, I was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement. I'd spent weeks preparing what to say, trying to balance my need for closure with my hope that Diane might finally understand the harm she'd caused. Diane claimed she was helping me recover from surgery by taking control of my home and my life, I said, addressing the court but looking directly at Diane. What she actually did was add psychological trauma to my physical recovery. She turned my sanctuary into a crime scene and my family relationships into battlegrounds. Her need to fix what she perceived as problems with my life caused damage that will take years to fully repair. I continued, but Diane also taught me something valuable about boundaries and self-advocacy. She showed me that no one has the right to override my choices about my own life, no matter how good their intentions or how certain they are that their way is better. She forced me to learn that accepting help doesn't mean surrendering autonomy, and that family relationships require mutual respect rather than unilateral control. Diane's face remained impassive throughout my statement, showing no sign that my words had penetrated her conviction that she'd been wrongly persecuted for trying to help. After the sentencing, James and I stood outside the courthouse in the rain, both emotionally exhausted but relieved that the legal proceedings were finally over. "How are you feeling?" James asked. "Sad for her, but glad it's finished. At least now there are consequences for what she did, and hopefully other people won't have to go through what we went through." "What about us? What happens to our relationship now that I'm divorced and she's in prison?" It was a fair question. The past year had forced both of us to examine our family dynamics and our own roles in enabling or tolerating problematic behavior. We'd grown closer through the crisis, but we'd also had to confront difficult truths about boundary setting and family loyalty. "I think we figure out how to be siblings again without the complication of your marriage to someone who couldn't respect boundaries," I said. "We start fresh and build something based on mutual respect rather than obligation." 6 months later, my life had settled into a new normal. My home was fully restored, though it would never be exactly as it was before Diane's intervention. Some things had been improved in the rebuilding process, others remained different as reminders of what I'd survived and overcome. My relationship with James continued to evolve as he learned to make decisions without Diane's input, and I learned to trust that he could distinguish between support and control. We had dinner together weekly, a tradition that honored our sibling bond while respecting each other's autonomy. Maya and I had used our experience with Diane's boundary violations to develop a new service line for our design business. helping people who'd experienced home invasions or property violations restore their spaces in ways that promoted healing and reclaimed ownership. "You turned your trauma into a way to help other people," Maya observed during one of our business planning sessions. "That's probably the best revenge of all." I thought about that comment often as I worked with clients who'd experienced similar violations. Helping other people reclaim their spaces and rebuild their sense of safety and autonomy felt like the most meaningful way to honor what I'd learned from my own experience. Diane would be eligible for parole in 4 years, assuming she participated in the counseling programs required by her sentence and demonstrated genuine acknowledgement of the harm she'd caused. Based on Dr. Foster's evaluation and Diane's behavior during the trial, I wasn't optimistic about her capacity for that level of self-reflection. But her potential for change wasn't my responsibility. My responsibility was to continue building a life that reflected my values and choices, maintaining boundaries that protected my autonomy while remaining open to genuine offers of help and support. The invasion of my home had been devastating, but it had also been educational. Diane had shown me exactly what could happen when someone decided they knew better than I did about my own life. She'd also shown me that I was strong enough to fight back, even when that fight required standing up to family members and pursuing legal consequences that would permanently alter family relationships. Most importantly, she'd taught me that the best defense against people who want to control your life is a clear understanding of your own values and the courage to defend them, even when that defense comes at great personal cost. As I sat in my restored home office one evening, working on a project that excited and challenged me, I reflected on how much had changed since that morning when I'd woken up in the hospital to discover that someone had taken over my life. The woman who'd survived that experience was stronger, wiser, and more confident in her ability to protect what mattered to her. Diane's attempt to control my life had ultimately freed me from any remaining uncertainty about my capacity to stand up for myself. Her violation of my boundaries had taught me exactly how strong those boundaries needed to be, and how vigilant I needed to remain in defending them. The best revenge I'd discovered wasn't punishment or retaliation. It was building a life so authentic and self-determined that no one else's opinion of how you should live could diminish your satisfaction with the choices you'd made. Diane was in prison, serving time for crimes motivated by her inability to respect other people's autonomy. I was home, surrounded by belongings I'd chosen, in spaces I'd designed, living a life that reflected my values rather than someone else's vision of what my life should be. In the end, we'd both gotten exactly what we deserved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.